Well, welcome to the Baker Institute. If you want to take your places, we're going to go ahead and get started. You all want to sit down, we'll get underway. Well, welcome to the Baker Institute and for the 13th International Space Medicine Summit. We're very pleased to have you here this morning. But I would like to observe a moment of silence because this morning we lost a real pioneer of the space program. Alexei Leonov passed away. So for at least a minute, we would like to pay homage to him. Well, we'll go ahead and get underway. And this morning we're going to have Ambassador Derision welcoming you. He's the director of the Baker Institute. And prior to that, he was Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs in the State Department of the United States and served as the ambassador both to Syria and Israel and has a tremendous background in world affairs and particularly in the Middle East. So let me turn it over to the ambassador.
Thank you very much, George, and a warm welcome to all of you this morning to Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy, to the 13th International Space Medicine Summit, a meeting that has become one of the world's premier space medicine events. And I want to really warmly congratulate George Abbey because without George, he created this conference series, and his incredible Rolodex in the space industry is amazing, and his success in making this one of the premier conferences is laudatory. So in addition to hosting the representatives from Europe, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan, I want to also give a very warm welcome to Texas A&M University, our co-host for the International Space Medicine Summit. We're pleased to have both our keynote speaker, Colonel Michael Fossum, the Chief Operating Officer of Texas A&M, University of Galveston, and Professor Bonnie Dunbar from Texas A&M with us this morning. So we warmly thank you for being here. I would also like to take a moment this morning to mention the late Bobby Alford of Baylor College of Medicine, who was another co-host for the summit. Bobby, as many of you know, was one of the founders of this summit, and his personal dedication and his vision have contributed greatly to its origins and to its success. He was a regular attendee, and he retired from Baylor after a long and very distinguished career, and as you know, he passed away last year. So throughout history, international cooperation between nations has brought about great changes across the world. A prime example of this is the International Space Station, and we are fortunate to have with us today, as a participant in the summit, the commander of the first International Space Station expedition, Bill Shepard. The potential benefits from an unprecedented global collaboration among 5 member space agencies representing 15 countries that have created the International Space Station can be far-reaching. Biology, biotechnology, human physiology, research on the station, for example, are leading to new insights into human health on Earth. As the International Space Station looks to the future partnerships, it would be important that China become a constructive partner and that our international crews can work together as one team toward a common goal of exploring outer space and furthering our scientific understanding of the universe. President Trump has now given NASA a charter to return to the moon, and there's a great deal of discussion, as you're well aware, on future human missions to Mars. Making such missions happen will require much more than rhetoric and just words. There are significant technical challenges to overcome and much more to learn about the effects of long-duration spaceflight on the human body. We are indeed fortunate to have the International Space Station as a research facility that can help provide the answers that are required to enable longer exploration missions. So this summit has a panel devoted to discussing the next cooperative states for lunar exploration and beyond. It is also very appropriate that we take time during this summit to recognize the Apollo program and the 50th anniversary of Apollo 11 and the first lunar landing. So I am pleased to note that there'll also be a panel on education, emphasizing the importance of encouraging future generations of young people, young students, to pursue careers in science and engineering. Their innovative new ideas will help enable the human exploration of space. So I wish you every success with your deliberations over these next few days, and thank you for being here and for your participation. Now I'll turn it over to George. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. I think Bonnie Dunbar is, we have Bonnie on the program to say a few words.
Well, good morning. It's really delightful to see all of you here as our meeting grows, and we have a mission back beyond staying in low Earth orbit, but proceeding beyond it, and a common interest. And I won't take very much time because I'm just an adopted Aggie, and I don't want to get in the way of the real Aggie. Mike will be up here in just a few minutes. But I do want to just share with you, some of you that are new, that as a former crew member, I'm not just here because I was a crew member. My interest in this topic started back in the 70s with Skylab and what was happening on Skylab. And as a ceramic engineer, I was very interested in bone as a ceramic and what was happening in disuse osteoporosis. And that led me to a large collection of literature that was the foundation for my dissertation when I received it at the University of Houston in the Mechanical Engineering Department. And so I've have remained very involved in this as from a vested point of view as a crew member, but also from a research point of view. So I'm very happy to be part of it. Also, as the co-chair of the Education Committee, I'd like to echo the words about the importance of investing in our next generation. And we do have some graduate students here and maybe some undergraduates. And so while we have this opportunity, let's recognize them. Would all the graduate students, including mine, please stand? We got them here this morning. Because they are the pipeline that will take our place in the decades to come, because I hope this grand venture of space exploration is here forever. As aviation was the pinnacle of technology in the last century, space exploration will have no bounds as we go forward in the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bonnie. Jeff?
Thank you, and good morning. On behalf of the organizing committee and the Center for Space Medicine at Baylor College of Medicine, I'd like to welcome you to ISMS 2019. Ambassador Dirigian, thank you as always for your eloquent remarks and for allowing us to have this meeting in this most beautiful and inspirational of settings. This meeting has taken place annually since 2007, and we would like to really thank all of you for making time in your busy schedules to attend the meeting. And especially warm welcome to our out-of-town guests, our international colleagues for participating in this meeting. We truly value your presence. So there's some very interesting panels, as has been already alluded to. Of course, the heart and soul of the meeting are the discussions that take place, the exchange of ideas, the warm camaraderie, the sharing of new knowledge and experiences. And I would also like to echo the ambassador's remarks about Mr. George Abbey, whose leadership and efforts have really been a driving force in successful summits over many years. So enjoy the meeting, and I hope that you find it to be productive. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Just a few comments relative to logistics. We do have the bus that goes over to the Marriott. Both takes people from there to here and takes you back there. Welcome, Leroy. And on Saturday afternoon, we will be divided into discussion groups. And I think on your badges, we have suggested groups that you would perhaps be interested in joining. But that'll be up to you all when you hear what the discussion groups are. If you choose to join another one, you feel free to do that. And we have normally had a speaker at lunch every day, but we now have panels at lunch. And so today we have, I think, a very interesting panel that is moderated by Richard Jennings, and I think you'll find interesting. And there'll be another panel tomorrow. But we'll go ahead and have the first panel come up and take their seats before we get the keynote speaker to speak. So if you all on that first panel would come up and take your places, and then we'll have the keynote speak. Yep. We have the whole panel up here?
Mike's not here.
Hmm?
Mike Lembeck, is he?
Well, you're not here, no, not yet. And our keynote speaker isn't here yet either, so.
Well, Leroy's ready to go.
But this first panel is on lunar exploration, and I think I'll go ahead and introduce it now because certainly, as the ambassador said, the president has given NASA the charter to go back to the moon and go back there by 2024. And we're fortunate to have the acting administrator for human exploration and operations missions directorate here, Ken Bowersox, who I hope we can provide some insight as to what NASA's plans are to achieve that goal, and I think you'll find that very interesting. And then we have a number of panelists that I think can comment about certainly their thoughts on lunar exploration. So I think that's certainly the next destination, and really people talk about going to Mars, but the only way to get to Mars is go through the moon, and the moon is a great proving ground for the systems and doing the training and learning to live and work in space. And you can do all that only 3 days away from the Earth, as opposed to a mission to Mars, which would, if you had a problem, would be a long distance to come back. But the moon is, I think, also interesting, very interesting scientifically. And I think we're going to hear a lot about why we should be going back to the moon probably on Saturday evening. I'll not talk a lot more about that. But I think since we are absent of our keynote speaker, we'll go ahead and get underway with the panel right now. And Leroy, who did show up, is the moderator, so I'll turn it over to him. Leroy.
All right, well, thank you, George, and welcome, everyone. I thought I was going to sneak in. I came in just after George began his remarks. I said, okay, I'll sit in and wait for him to introduce the keynote speaker, and I'll sneak in. I didn't figure on the door being latched. So, anyway, always make a splash, right? Well, it is my pleasure again to be here this year at the ISMS. I've been part of the ISMS Planning Committee for a number of years and participated and know pretty much everyone here, not quite everyone, but great to be here again and to be moderating this first panel. Lunar exploration, of course, is something near and dear to probably everyone in this room. I myself was 8 years old when Apollo 11 landed on the moon 50 years ago, and that's what inspired me to want to become an astronaut myself. We've got a wonderful panel, and before we get into too many remarks, I'll go ahead and introduce each panel member and then ask each panel member just to say a few words on what they feel about lunar exploration. Our first panelist, of course, is Ken Bowersox, and Sox, of course, is a veteran astronaut, commander of the International Space Station, commander of Space Shuttle, done a number of different things, started life as a Navy pilot, flew on 4 shuttle missions, 2 as commander, and I mentioned he was commander of ISS 6. He was the vice president of astronaut safety and mission assurance at SpaceX for a few years before going out and doing other things, became head of the NASA Advisory Council and is currently the acting AA for spaceflight. And so it's really great to have Sox on the panel. Sox was, I shared an office with Sox when I first came to NASA. We shared an office for about a year with another one of my fellow ASCANs. And so Sox was always one of my heroes from the beginning. So Ken, would you like to say a few words?
Sure. How long do you want us to talk, Leroy?
Oh, just go ahead, just 2-3 minutes.
Like 2, 3? Okay. Because Walt was asking me.
We'll let Walt go on as long as
as he wants.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's really great to be here. You guys have heard that we're going to the moon. This time it's a little bit different. We've got a directive from the president, and it says that NASA is supposed to lead an innovative exploration program with international and commercial partners, and that we're supposed to go to the moon, Mars, and then it actually talks about going beyond Mars, right? So the plan that we're laying out is more than going to the surface of the moon. It's building the capability to take humanity even further, to go past the moon. That was what we were doing with Apollo 2. I don't think anything's really changed in the last 50 years. But we're thinking more about how we broaden the program, bring in all our partners. When we were tasked back in March to accelerate, we already had a lot of this strategy in place. And so internally we said, what do we do? How do we accelerate? Well, one of the long poles for any government program is procuring the services from a contractor. So we knew we were going to have to do some sort of expedited procurement process. Luckily, we had a system in place that we could just sort of turn the knob and increase the speed on procurement, and that was the next step broad area announcements. And if any of you have been watching, you'll see different appendixes for that particular procurement mechanism just keep ticking off as we go on and try to set up relationships with different partners. The other thing we knew was going to be really important is balancing our requirements with our resources. So the first thing we did was look at what we were technically requiring. The program that we had back in March, one of the key aspects was we wanted 4 crew persons to the lunar surface. As we talked to the technical folks, we knew that was going to be tough to do by 2024. So we backed off that number to 2 people. And a couple other areas we looked at restrictions. We also looked at what we might do less initially on the gateway in order to keep it moving forward. But then we also went out and asked for additional funding. And that's where we'll really see how serious our country is about accelerating the capability to get to the lunar surface, is when we see what comes back from the Congress on funding. And we're starting to get feedback from them now in their marks. The last point I'd like to make is that the heart of our exploration program is what you see up here. It's great to have a slide to talk to, even though we're not supposed to have slides. But it's the International Space Station. At the International Space Station, we're going to be developing hardware that's critical for going to the moon and onto Mars, especially life support systems. It's going to take years of runtime in low Earth orbit. In microgravity, actually, we're finding that we need to test life support systems in microgravity. We're also going to be developing commercial capabilities for crew transport and cargo. But I think even more important than that on ISS, we're building our partnerships, right? I mentioned the commercial partnerships, but also our international partnerships. We want to take that international community and move it out to cislunar space. The first place we're doing that is with the Gateway. That's the most logical step. It's the step we could get the most of our partners to take. It's the easiest place for a lot of our commercial partners to get to. We'll build the Gateway. Now, the Gateway that we're talking about initially is smaller, but we still have international contributions that are going to allow us to grow that and get more of the knowledge we need to go to Mars. And then take all that time that we've developed in low Earth orbit, the time with our crews, the health knowledge that a lot of the team in here has been putting together, and then that is what's going to allow us to go to Mars, that knowledge. And so that's kind of the strategy moving forward, is to build up the whole plan. Going to the surface requires getting landers built. We have to talk about habitats. That's a separate effort. We can ramp that up and go faster. We can ramp it back and go more slowly to the lunar surface. I think once we're anchored in cislunar space, there's no doubt we're going to get to the lunar surface. But part of the strategy is to anchor in cislunar space with the Gateway, get to the surface, learn everything we can on the ISS, Gateway, and the lunar surface to go to Mars.
Okay, thanks, Sox. So I did not learn of Alexei Leonov's passing until I walked in the door and heard George talking about a moment of silence for him. So I personally am deeply saddened about that, because as a fellow spacewalker, he, of course, was the first one to do a spacewalk, a pioneer of many things. And a few years ago, he was on a panel here talking about EVA, and I was the moderator, and I failed in my duties, but I was damned if I was going to stop him. But he talked about, there was basically an oral history of what was going on back in those days. And he went on for over an hour, took up all the panel time, and we ran over by about another hour. And I was admonished by George afterwards, but I wanted to hear it. And similarly, Walt is a pioneer. Walt is, of course, an Apollo astronaut, Apollo 7. He's done a lot of other things. He was a Marine Corps fighter pilot. He flew as the Apollo 7 LMP, checking out the Apollo command module after the Apollo 1 fire and after the whole vehicle was, the crew babysat. The new spacecraft was completely redesigned, and they flew their relatively long mission for being in a capsule anyway, in low Earth orbit to check everything out. And it was because their mission was so successful that we were able to launch Apollo 11 eventually on time to make that deadline of landing on the moon before the decade was out. And in addition, after Walt left NASA, he's been an entrepreneur, he's been a venture capitalist, he's been a successful business person. And so I'm going to let Walt talk as long as he wants, just like I did Alexei. And Walt, please, we'd like to hear your remarks. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I won't, I can't talk very much about the moon because I was one of those few people in the Apollo command module that didn't get to go to the moon, which was kind of sad about that. But I have to tell you, when I took a look and saw the program that we were going to be having on here, I was absolutely amazed. A whole panel here, not one of us ever really got into that aspect of it. And I do think things were different in those days. I feel fortunate that since the Apollo program was over, I've been close, I've got friends, I've been able to basically follow pretty good all the programs since. And I think that we're kind of losing a little bit of the sense that the landing of man on the moon, that Apollo program was, in fact, different than the programs you see today. And part of the reason that was different is, unfortunately, in my opinion, we've allowed people's attitude to change on almost everything. I think that machine up here, for example, I think it's the greatest flying machine that we ever put up. But the concept and the people that are working on it, doing a lot more work than we did, longer periods and all that kind of stuff, it's kind of a different attitude than we had. And I'll show you this. Back in Apollo, I don't know a soul that was working with us on Apollo that wasn't willing to commit his life to that job. And today the people, because they're younger, they frequently don't understand the concept that we had. They also don't, for example, I was on Apollo 7. Well, Apollo 7 ended up being the first manned Apollo mission. But nobody understands that was our third attempt to do that. Originally, Wally Schraw, Don Isley, and I, we were the Apollo 2. Gus Grissom and his crew was Apollo 1. And then as we couldn't keep the schedule, it kept sliding down, they ended up canceling Apollo 2 after about 8 months. A week or so later, we became the backup crew on Apollo 1. And at least Isley and I, we thought that would probably put you in place for some later mission on there. But after we became the backup crew on Apollo, what ended up being Apollo 1, it was about I think it was like 12 weeks later, our friends died in that fire on the pad. A couple weeks later, at the time that happened, that crew that died thought they were within 4 to 6 weeks of making a lunar mission. And we were all pretty much aware that there were some deficiencies in the hardware that was going on because it was a brand new contractor, North American. We lived with them actually out there. Then well, you probably aware, I'm not going to go into the crew that died on that thing. It was on a Friday. And a couple weeks after that, we were assigned then the Apollo mission again, Apollo 1. And it was to get from there to get a liftoff on it, that was 21 months after that time to get that spacecraft to go. And so here's the crews that were going to be flying, and they were spending their time understanding everything you could about the missions. So when you're starting programs, especially space programs, there's a whole lot more work and things involved than the public at large really gets very much aware of. They think that everything is going just great all the time. And I can assure you that there's a lot of people in this room that know that it's not that consistently great when that's going on. But I'll do one more thing here on it. The Apollo program, we landed a man on the moon. I run into people today who think that was the first Apollo mission. We landed on the moon. And I tried to point out, no, we had Apollo 1 was to test the spacecraft. Apollo 2, which was an unusual change in the program, was inserted in the program, go out to the moon for a while, around the moon. Then there's finally, after all these years working on it, finally they got a test mission for the service module. And then we were able to get away from the Earth's gravitational field here on Apollo 10 and get out there. Some people today will try to tell you that Apollo 10 could have landed on the moon if they had decided to do that. It's nonsense. They could not have, but they came close. And it was a very thrilling kind of mission. And then you get Apollo 11, and I'm one of those people that I think that 500 years from now, there's only going to be one thing that they really remember about the Apollo program, and that's Apollo 11. And I think it's probably going to go down in history as long as America is around. I'll stop there. I just want to let you know how fortunate I feel to have been at NASA when I was, and now that's made me the oldest guy in the room. Thank you.
Thank you, Walt. Well, Alexei Leonov beat that by about a factor of 7, I think, so you did great. Our next panelist, of course, is a veteran astronaut, Dr. Bonnie Dunbar. Bonnie was an engineer, as you heard her say before becoming an astronaut, and she went on to fly 5 space shuttle missions, and she served after she left NASA, served for many years as the president and CEO of the Museum of Flight up in Seattle, before being recruited to come back to Houston to lead the University of Houston STEM Center. And then fairly recently, she went off to Texas A&M, where she is now the director of Aerospace Human Systems Lab at Texas A&M Universities. Bonnie?
Oh, thank you, Leroy. So I don't have the specific perspectives that Walt has on Apollo, but we overlap a little bit because my education was a product of Apollo, as some of you may have known. We landed on the moon between my sophomore and junior years at the University of Washington, where I was majoring in engineering. And I was at the university with probably under the same auspices as about 50% of my classmates, in that we were products of the National Defense Education Act, which at that time provided loans and grants to a lot of farm kids like myself, kids that couldn't afford to go to college, but had the GPA and the SAT and wanted to be part of space. So the NDA was responsible for thousands of graduates in engineering, kind of a bow wave. And our inspiration was space. And I eventually, before I became a government employee, I was working on the space shuttle. In fact, before the shuttle was built, I worked on Columbia for Rockwell International, Palmdale. I saw what it took to build a vehicle, was part of the thermal protection system development, understood what science had to go into that in engineering, because as an undergraduate at the University of Washington, I was part of a NASA grant developing the materials for those tiles. And I talk about that because that has then molded my perspective on our continued exploration, in that as we include the commercial and industry world in going back, we need to not leave our universities behind, nor the science and engineering that they produce. We had successful tiles because we funded 3 different universities, including Rice University, by the way, to look at different materials that would sustain the temperatures of reentry and be reusable. That technology, that information then was managed by NASA and shared with the industry, and Rockwell won the primary contract, and then the subcontractor was Lockheed Space and Missiles. So there are many partners to this space exploration. And there's also a sense that, since we've been there, we must know everything, right? Been there once. But what is lost in much of the discussion is what we don't know. And what we don't know, particularly in putting humans on the surface of the moon for a long period of time, is what 1,6G does for fluids, liquids, gases, and how that impacts everything from life support systems to any commercial products we might be thinking about in situ research utilization. We don't have any analytical models. In fact, I have one of my students right now looking at some of the first conceptual fluid dynamic models, CFD, for how liquids and gases interact in 1,6G. And the only way we'll be able to prove those models, because they are so important to fuel management and life support systems, is to eventually put an experiment on the moon. So in fact, we have a lab at Texas A&M called AggieSat, and we want to be the first small sat on the moon to do fluid physics research. There's a lot of room for investment in that area for students and research that is going to be critical for our success in the future, for long-term viability on the moon, just as we have long-term stations in Antarctica, and we've learned to live there. We've learned to elevate our research stations as the snows build up. We've put technology in that. We've wintered over. We're dealing with life support systems and human physiology. We'll need to do that with the moon, and there are many technologies we're going to have to develop. So I come at that from that perspective as an engineer. I'm excited about going to the moon. I'm an explorer, and I want to be there. But I think we need to make sure we've got the foundations to stay there. What we will learn about working and performing research in 1,6G will then give us another data point between 0 and 1. And I know that John Charles has this great chart with the large unknown between 0 and 1, even in human physiology. But it'll give us another data point. And we've already learned in some of our combustion research at Glenn Research Center, as well as in some of the work that we're doing in our lab, that you can't just take the results and take 1,6G. That especially in fluid physics and surface tension and a number of other variables you're dealing with, it's going to be complex. And our life support systems are going to need to work for a long period of time. Fuel management, if we're going to work on that and launching to Mars. So I just, as we go forward in this conference the next 3 days and we think about education, I want to make that emphasis not just as a philosophical point of view, but as we look at the dollars now coming out of NASA, and we all understand the timeline that's driving this, but there are very few dollars coming to universities and very few dollars in engineering. And that's how we educate the engineers that are going to fulfill those jobs of the future in the next decade and going on to Mars. We have to graduate students, not train them on the job in industry. We have to help them be leaders in the government and industry.
Okay, thank you, Bonnie. Our next panelist, I think, is known to everyone in this room. He's participated in, if not all, then almost all of our ISMS meetings. Michael Lembeck has had quite the career. He's, of course, is an engineer and currently serves as a professor. He is currently the visiting professor of the practice in aerospace engineering at the University of Illinois. And prior to that, he led multiple government and commercial spaceflight programs. He also served as the a division director at NASA headquarters. And I'll let him tell you a little bit more about himself. Mike?
Thanks, Leroy. First, I want to echo everything Bonnie just said, except for one thing she got wrong. Illinois will be on the moon before A&M. I teach spacecraft design at the university today, and I had an interesting conversation with my counterpart who teaches the aircraft design part of the course. And we were comparing where the system engineering process starts. And for airplanes, you have commercial customers, and their market defines how the commodity of the airplane itself is used, and that commodity itself generates the revenue for that customer. And it turns out that spacecraft design is a lot different. Our requirements don't come from a market. They come from more or less policy, politics, the national academies. And so it's a very different way in which the systems engineering process is set off and started. And it's interesting that, there's really no market per se for the things we do in exploration. To give you an example, I think this will bring it home for everybody on the machine we've been talking about back here. If we had a pile of lead that we could put into a Falcon 9 and a Dragon capsule and take it to the space station today, lead's about $2 a kilogram. And we met Merlin the magician up on the space station. Merlin waved his magic wand and turned that into gold. And gold's right at about $38,000, $40,000 a kilogram today. Brought that back down. How much money do you think we would make on that exercise? Well, it turns out we'd lose $98 million because of the cost of transportation. So in order for there to be a market, you have to have something that is more valuable than a precious metal in order to be able to bring it back home and make a profit off it. And if you get something like an asteroid where you have a lot of those precious metals when you bring it back, inelastic pricing now starts to work against you because you have a lot of the material, which means its value is dropped. So it's very difficult to define a commercial market, if you will, for space, and particularly for lunar exploration. For lunar exploration, the top three objectives I think you can see are national security, science, and perhaps ego, in at least one case, to go back to the moon. So history is littered with a number of airplanes and other systems that have been defined by objectives that did not line up with the requirements, that did not line up with the process that was used to generate those things. And I think it's important for lunar exploration in particular that all three of those things need to line up in the future if we're going to have a successful program. Thanks.
Thank you, Mike. Our next panelist, Don Pettit. Dr. Pettit is a fellow chemical engineer. I don't know if there are any other chemical engineers, but there are at least two. And he also is a veteran of the national labs. I came out of the Lawrence Livermore National Lab, and he came out of the Los Alamos National Lab, so he probably worked on more secret stuff than I did.
Those were competing labs.
Just a little bit, you think? Not unlike some NASA centers, I think. But Don, of course, is a veteran astronaut to 2 International Space Station missions and 1 shuttle mission, I believe. And he is currently still an active astronaut. And Don, we'd like to hear from you, please.
In between your flights, you end up with a ground job. And I noticed George is really laughing because he used to assign most of the ground jobs. Well, my current ground job, I'm working on lunar lander and lunar surface science. So it's like being thrown into the briar patch for me. So this is fun stuff. So what I get to do on a daily basis now, I tell my boys, I get to go to work and have a techno food fight because we are arguing and discussing and working on how the lunar lander, some of the large design details of the lunar lander, you know, what it should be and what should the lunar science stuff be. And things that are seemingly simple, like what's the cabin pressure? And you could get into huge arguments and discussions. Something as simple as what should the cabin pressure be, which also specifies composition, and it has huge impacts on the mission operations and even the design of the spacecraft. And how many people here have either read the book or seen the movie The Right Stuff? Okay, almost everybody. And you remember the scene in the movie where the astronauts had to have a conniption fit with the engineers because they wanted a window, and the engineers didn't want to put a window in the Mercury spacecraft. Well, history's repeating itself because, and Sox knows this because he probably saw the aftermath of our office working on it, but there was going to be no requirement to have a window in the lunar lander. And so anyway, this is just examples of stuff that we're working on a daily basis. And it actually doesn't get any better than this. It seems like we're sitting there haggling and arguing, and then after that we all go out and drink a beer together and have fun. So it's what is part of the design of any complex technical program. Now, in terms of lunar science, we're targeting the South Pole region, particularly because of the volatiles that we know are there. And one of the major constituents of the volatiles is water. And if you look at a person in a spacesuit, they're kind of like the Pigpen character from the Peanuts comic strip, because there's this cloud of detritus that follows you around. A lot of it's water vapor because you use a sublimator to cool yourself, and you're always venting off water vapor. And if you're going into these permanently shadowed regions to collect samples of primordial water, and you're this Pigpen character in a spacesuit, how do you know that the water you're collected just doesn't come from your spacesuit? So one of the things we're thinking is, let's have isotopically labeled water in the sublimators of our spacesuits, so that way when we do collect volatile samples, we can at least tell what part of it came from the human beings and what part of it was the primordial aspect of the water accumulating there. So anyway, that's what we're working on right now. As a techno uber geek, it doesn't get any better than this, and I'm looking forward to see when all the chalk dust ends up settling, what we end up having for not only the 2024-ish missions. Socks, you're giving me the evil eye.
Depends on the money, right?
Yeah. You know, it depends on the money. But the 2024-year-ish missions, and then more important, the sustained presence on the moon. What happens with that?
Thank you, Don. Don, of course, as you can tell, is a techno geek, self-described engineer, but also has that wonderful operational experience to recognize the need for a window. And I believe, and George and others in the room who were there can confirm, but I believe in the shuttle days, there was a big argument on whether or not to put windows in the space shuttle as well. So, and space station as well? Is that right? Oh, boy. Oh, I hadn't heard that one. That's awesome. Okay, our next panelist, Bill Shepard. Bill Shepard has also been a participant in the ISMS for many years, and Shep was one of the first guys I met when I went to NASA. Shep, of course, is a Navy SEAL and an astronaut, and for many years he was the only Navy SEAL. I believe we selected another Navy SEAL fairly recently, just in the last few years. Shep was famous for, in his selection interview, being asked what would he bring to the program, what unique qualities would he bring to the program, and the rumor has it that he thought about it for a moment and said, well, I can kill a man with my bare hands. So Shep has served on 3 shuttle missions. He flew aboard Soyuz, and he was also the commander of ISS-1, the very first International Space Station mission. So he's very much been a pioneer, but what you may not know is he worked quite a bit behind the scenes to get to where we had an ISS. He and Jim Weatherby went up to headquarters for quite a while, and they were laying out different options for the administrator and the Congress for how we were going to proceed with this thing called Freedom that had kind of become an albatross. And so he really played a key role in helping to evolve the program into what became ISS and ultimately became a very successful program. So, Shep?
Thanks, Leroy. I feel a little bit sorry for Socks. He's the only guy in this room who's got to figure out, as far as lunar exploration goes, why we're going to do it, when it's going to happen, and how much we got to pay for it. I'm going to jump ahead. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I see as what we should do that's different in a lunar program. You look at Mars, a mission to Mars is going to have a whole different scheme for doing aborts. We're not going to abort on a Mars mission. We're probably going to go around the back of Mars and come back. It's going to be several years of space flight. It means that we'll probably have multiple vehicles. We're going to have a whole different scheme for redundancy. The crews are going to be capable of doing a lot of things standalone that are right now directed by the ground. That's all going to change. And we're going to have tremendous needs for different kinds of power and energy. I don't think we're going to do a lot with a Mars mission without nuclear propulsion and nuclear power. A lot of work to be done on in situ resources, and particularly something for this group, I would say we're going to have to do in situ healthcare. We don't know how to do that on a foreign body. So all these things are going to be key elements. If we have a really valuable lunar program, we got to figure out how to do this stuff. I would commend to the people who are trying to manage the moon program some comparison with how ISS got started and how it runs today, in that several crew people on orbit have to deal with thousands, if not tens of thousands of people on the ground who want to have things done a certain way, or who like hardware in a certain configuration or a certain operational procedure. And in a sense, the ISS crew are the final integrators for how all that is going to work. And in the early days of the program, it was pretty ugly. I would say it's not completely beautiful now, but it's working. And the path forward for a lunar program is to do our best in enabling a small number of people to operate very complex systems built by disparate individuals and companies and have them mesh together well. This is a process and a skill that I don't think we at NASA, the United States, or the foreign partners have really mastered. And this is something that worries me greatly when I look at how many different contracts, contractors, vehicles, and stuff that's got to come together to have a lunar mission. I think that's, to me, one of the biggest technical problems we have.
All right, thank you, Shep. And speaking of the International Space Station, some years ago I served on a committee, and one of our big findings of the best things that came out of ISS was the fact that we created this wonderfully working international framework, and we could not have done the ISS without our international partners. And so our last but not least committee member, of course, is one of our represents one of our international partners. Dr. Isabel Tremblay, we haven't personally met yet, but certainly welcome you to the panel. She works for the Canadian Space Agency. She's the director of astronauts, life science, and space medicine. I think that would be 3 different directorates at NASA. She's doing all 3. She's has a history in operational biomedical considerations for spaceflight, including for future exploration missions, and previously worked as a development engineer on many programs, including the Phoenix Mars lander and also the James Webb Space Telescope, which I had the good fortune to see very recently down at Northrop Grumman down in Los Angeles area. So welcome, Isabel.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So good morning, everybody. Since I'm from Canada, Canadian Space Agency, I will speak about the international perspective mainly, but start maybe by saying that I wasn't born when Apollo landed on the moon. Unfortunately, I missed that moment. But I would say I was born in a world where that quest was accomplished, and that was very important. Everything was possible. And if I think of my childhood, I thought that today we would be much further than we are, because it was so immense to have landed on the moon, but it was done. So what else could we do? Everything, all the possibilities were open. It was incredible to be born in a world like that. And then I will mention that recently on October 5th was the 35th anniversary of Marc Garneau's flight on STS-41G. So he was the first Canadian in outer space. It was very important for Canada. It opened a new chapter for us, a new era in our space program. It was the first day of our human exploration program in a way. And that opened so many possibilities, a realm of new possibilities for young Canadians like me. Which inspired me greatly. So that was very important. And this was possible because Canada contributed the first Canadarm to the Space Shuttle program. And in exchange of that contribution, then we were invited to recruit astronauts and to have astronauts, Canadian astronauts. And the impact of having Canadians in space was humongous. It was so inspiring, so important for Canadians. And that was a collaboration, international collaboration for us before the International Space Station. So it started well before that. And then we expanded our contribution to the International Space Station with a mobile servicing system. So the robots that are used almost every day now on the station were used to assemble the station module by module, but also to maintain it. So it's a critical contribution. We're very proud of that, but this is also, it was a very important contribution for Canada, much more important in scope than the first Canadarm. And critical contribution now we see today. So very, very important. And international collaboration really is a means to achieve our bold goals in space exploration, human space exploration, but also one of the most important benefits. So that's what we learned as a member of the International Space Station program. And then very recently, we committed to be part of the next big objective, which is to return to the moon in a sustainable way. So Canada committed to contribute a Canadarm3 for lunar exploration. And for us, we committed early, also with the first international partner to commit to do this with NASA, with Americans. That speaks about our long-standing relationship. So Canada and the US, very important. And we continue to foster this relationship, but that was a major commitment for Canada. And in achieving this objective of a sustainable lunar exploration program and having humans on the moon sustainably. So we strongly believe in that, and that early commitment is a testimony of how important it is for Canada. So so there is robotics, of course. That's our iconic, I would say, contribution. But we're looking into other areas. As Leroy mentioned, we're looking at healthcare, and we're looking also at food production. It's in our new space strategy for Canada. And those areas are important. We talk about commercialization and markets, and there's no markets in space, and it makes things challenging. We need to do something very profitable or find something where we can make a profit is difficult because access to space is still very expensive. But the way we approach it now is that we look into those areas that are the convergence of the space exploration, human space exploration, and terrestrial needs. So for Canada, healthcare is one of those areas, and food production also, because we have needs in Canada on Earth. For example, our remote communities are not as well served from a healthcare perspective, and by law they should be. So we need to find solutions, and that's where the needs of deep space exploration and enabling the crew to take charge of their own health resonates with the need of our communities in the north of Canada. And for food production, it's the same thing. So we have those challenges. So for us, it's about making money on Earth as well, but in relation to space exploration. That's a way to make it, that's a way that we can make it sustainable and where we can generate economy in a transition to a real space economy. So that's part of our strategy. So I will say to finish that there is a say, I think it's an African proverb that says, if we want to go fast, we go alone, and if we want to go far, we go together. So we can see that with space station, going together was key and having a sustainable presence in space. And I believe that for the moon, it's the same thing. You want to go fast, you go alone. You want to accomplish this quest first and pave the way. But if we want to have a sustainable presence on the moon, then we have to do this together. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Isabel. Want to applaud? Some people want to applaud. Yeah, certainly we have benefited from this international cooperation, specifically with Canada. Isabel talked about the Canadarm, both on the shuttle and the station. We could not have built the station into what it was without those robotics, both on the shuttle and the station. So that's just one example of the benefits of this kind of cooperation. Another thing that Dr. Tremblay said that kind of jogged my memory, one of my good buddies, Koichi Wakata, I don't believe he's here at this meeting this year, but I flew with Koichi on 2 shuttle missions. I also flew with Chiaki Mukai, who is here, on both of our first shuttle missions, space mission. But Koichi told me that as a young boy, he dreamed in Japan, living in Japan, he dreamed about becoming an astronaut, even though Japan didn't have really a space program at all, and certainly had no human spaceflight program, and was not working with NASA on human spaceflight. Nevertheless, he never forgot that dream. He grew up, studied engineering, and then the opportunity came for Chiaki, Koichi, and the other Japanese astronauts when Japan started working with NASA. And so the fact that Dr. Tremblay was also inspired as a young person, even though by the time she was an adult, we were already working together. It's one of the intangible things that come out of a space program is the fact that you're inspiring your young, and you inspire them never to give up and never to think that it's not possible, even if your countries aren't working together. So anyway, let's go ahead and dive in. Thank you, everyone, for your remarks. I think everybody had some nice different perspectives on the lunar programs that may be coming. We're supposed to focus on 2 specific points. One is lunar exploration and international cooperation, which everyone's talked a little bit about, and also private companies, or commercial companies, I should say, and their role in supporting lunar exploration. But we're not limited to those topics, so I'm going to wake everyone up and just as I made a splash in my entrance here, go ahead and dive into the elephant in the room. The fact is, and I think everybody agrees, and Walt certainly, and George can certainly talk to this later, is that the reason we were successful with Apollo and we went from zero, from NASA not even existing to landing on the moon in just under 11 years, is because the politics were lined up. Right? Everybody was afraid of the Soviet menace, and we saw this as a war footing. We were fighting the Cold War, and this was an imperative. This was a matter of national security. We had Republicans, Democrats, everyone working together and agreed that this was absolutely vital to the nation, and that's why we did it. So today, of course, those politics aren't here, and they haven't been here for quite a while. And so the trick is, if we're going to get back to the moon, especially as Don so eloquently put it, 2024-ish, how do we get the politics to line up? And so that's quite a tall order. I don't care which side of the aisle your personal politics are on. I think we can all agree that the president, the administration, and the Congress hate each other. Okay, so how are we gonna make this work? And I'm gonna pick on Sox a little bit, since he's the acting AA for space flight, and ask him. That's quite a tall order for the administrator. And I'm also gonna ask Mike to jump in, and anyone else on the panel. But Sox, how do you have an idea how we can get this to work? You mentioned money. Of course, we've got to have the money, but the money will come if the politics line up. So what can NASA do to try to get the politics to line up?
Well, first, if you're expecting the politics to line up before we get to the moon or Mars, it's going to be a really long time. That's my observation.
Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of.
Now, on the other hand, what I'm seeing is that space exploration is something that there's bipartisan support for, right? But if you look at the plan that we've laid out, it's intended to build bipartisan support. Something that a lot of people, and I didn't realize until I got to Washington, was right now in the U.S., when you talk moon, that's more of a Republican kind of issue. When you talk Mars, that's more of a Democratic type of issue. If you talk moon to Mars, that's both, and you can talk to both parties and get bipartisan support. So there's a reason that we don't just talk about going to the lunar surface. It's another reason why Gateway is so important, is because it's both, right? So it's a program that's designed to work technically and politically. And I mean, I don't know if we can do a lot better. We're open to suggestions if you have any.
Mike, do you want to jump in?
Well, I was around at the time of the formulation of the original commercial crew and cargo missions and laid down the requirements for that. And I can tell you that a lot of the contractors at the time laid out schedules and budgets that would have been successfully delivering systems in around 2015. The Congress didn't follow through, so there's a case of misalignment. And now we're beating up on the contractors because they're not making the dates, because they didn't have the resources to get there. And no one back in the Congress is taking any blame for this. And again, when you misalign objectives and requirements and resources, you end up with programs that either don't deliver on time or the kinds of things you're looking for. So that's SOX's challenge, and the rest of NASA and all of us here in the room as well, is how do we get our representatives to line up with the things we want to see done? And I think, I'm not sure there's a really good answer out there just yet.
Yeah, and I remember when I was interviewing to be an astronaut in 1989, that was a time of great excitement. President Bush 41 had just talked about the Space Exploration Initiative, where we were going to go to the moon and then go to Mars by the 30th anniversary of Apollo 11, which would have been this year. And boy, had asked for like a 23% increase in NASA's budget, and we had a budget director and administration that was very much pro-space, and that unfortunately unraveled as well. And I see Bonnie's hand, but Walt wanted to say a few things first, I think. Or you want Bonnie? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I still think education is important, but not just to our students. I was at NASA headquarters in 1993 when we formed Code U. Some of you might remember the old Code U, Office of Life and Microgravity Sciences and Applications. It was also the year in which we voted. The Congress voted for the space station. It won by one vote. And I was in charge of looking at the various three design options in terms of their ability to do research, and we reported to the VEST committee, and after we had made our recommendations, then there was another redesign which brought in the Russian Space Agency. That all happened in 1993. I spent a lot of time on the Hill as a deputy AA, and not lobbying, but educating. And this is what I would hear. Why do we need a space station to do microgravity research when you have those zero-gravity rooms at the Johnson Space Center? Or a congressperson who said, well, you know, we just go back to Mars and, you know, stand next to the flags we planted there in the 1960s. We have a job to do, not just to our elected officials, but to their staffers as well. Those staffers, that's why I'm a big proponent of engineering students getting congressional internships, because they bring some technical knowledge to it, but they're few and far between. Most of the interns there are in political science, and they will brag about not being good at math. So if we want them to vote intelligently, we have to put a little energy in helping them be a little more intelligent.
That kind of reminded me of just a funny little thing I'll talk about just for a moment. Not too long ago, within the last couple of years, I was meeting with a vice president of a company, not an aerospace company, but this person asked me, "Oh, are you one of the astronauts that went to Mars?" And I very politely explained that, you know, we had not sent anyone to Mars yet. And, or I didn't actually say that. I said, no, I spent my career in low Earth orbit on space shuttles and on the space station. And then later afterwards, I kind of thought about them and said, I bet that person thinks I'm one of those loser astronauts that didn't get to Mars. Why are we hiring this guy? Well,
well, my personal observation, watching for the last 50 years, on NASA and actually projects in general too, we have a different attitude collectively as a society on expenditures, what to do, how much to stick your neck out to do it. And I look back at the Apollo program, and, you know, to land a man on the moon. At the time, how ridiculous. How difficult. That was, I think, very few people in the population thought we could do that, especially within 10 years. Hell, I even was a little bit slow about accepting 10 years on that. Society has been moving on since that has happened, and the costs of everything, a lot of people don't even worry about it or face that right now. Back in those days, the Apollo program, the landing a man on the moon, that was going to be a $20 billion program. Now, we know today that $20 billion, that would be a cheap program if you could accomplish something really good. That $20 billion really turns out to be $25 billion, which was, an over cost, but everybody was very happy with it. If you convert that to today's money, that's equivalent to about 140 or 150 billion dollars. And if you go back and look at NASA's budget today, they're down around $20 billion. To do anything like get back to the moon or the more difficult program of going out and landing on Mars, we've got to start getting realistic about it and quit fooling ourselves and thinking we can do it without that much of total expenditures and what have you. One of the advantages that we had out of the Apollo program was the technology has continued to evolve in many of those areas. And that does, in fact, mean that the equivalent challenge today, or the objective you were setting on a space program like going to Mars, would be a little less expensive if you could compare them to the society at those different times. But it'd be a lot of money. And what we have done is we've been busy trying to make all of these social kind of programs. There was an objective back in those days when we did that, and it was publicly. Everybody knew that was to excel and beat the Russians. Have you noticed that I've watched the Russian space program. I'm not an expert in it at all, but I've watched it over the years. I don't see that they've really stuck their neck out very much at all compared to what we did back in the Apollo program back in the 1960s. And the costs are a lot. And of course, for them, they can make a profit because we're paying them just to get our people up in Earth orbit. So there's a different kind of effort that's going on. There's a different kind of orientation. Publicly, the group, society in general, has a different assessment of risk and whether you should have a risk in your life or not. I have to tell you, back in our days, no, we weren't trying to just commit suicide, but I'll tell you this, we all knew what the risk was. And rightly or wrongly, we all thought we could handle that probably. And so we need to get back to where we're thinking like that instead of thinking that it's going to be so safe that nobody has to worry about it. It's going to be very, very expensive. It's going to have to exceed the priorities we place on some of the other things. And one more last thought on it. NASA should be, in my opinion, concentrating on projects and what we're going to do, the moon or Mars or what have you, instead of just diversifying in all kinds of other things today. So you can shoot me for that.
Thanks, Walt. I think we have a comment here or a question.
Pertinent to your topic, Leroy, do we think there's any chance that the really rapid advances the Chinese space agency is making might be an inspirational point for some of our American congressional representatives? My worry is that it's not widely publicized, or I don't think the general American public knows much about the Chinese program.
Right. And of course, back in 2003, when China launched Yang Liwei as their first national astronaut, there was this kind of a little bit of a fervor within NASA that perhaps there would be a new space race, and that would energize the United States to really accelerate programs to go to the moon and to Mars, and that didn't happen. And China's been, very quiet lately. They have announced that officially that they do want to send their astronauts to the moon, but they haven't launched a crew in a number of years now. And they're being very cautious. And of course, the last thing they want is a failure. So, and of course, they are very opaque. We don't know exactly what's going on in their program. Does any committee members want to comment on that? The possibility of a new space race?
Well, I think China? The Chinese are the real competition today, personally. That's my thought.
Yeah, they're very, of course, historically have had a very long view of things, and so I think they're in human space flight to stay, and they will make good on their commitment to land astronauts on the moon, and maybe it'll be that event that, wakes us up. I don't know.
One of the things I'm seeing is there are a lot of people that are concerned about what the folks from China may be doing in space. And it's one of the reasons for our lunar effort, right, is to establish a strategic presence. You'll see that in some of our presentation materials. But you can gauge the amount of concern by the amount of money that comes towards the program. And just, as a reference for you guys right now, we asked for an increase of about $1.6 billion in our budget to be able to accelerate the program. $1 billion of that was going to go to landers. In the marks coming back from the Senate right now, we got roughly 3/4 of what we asked for landers, and in the marks that we got from the House, we got nothing for landers, a small amount. So you can see that concern for establishing a strategic presence on the lunar surface anyway hasn't really reached our Congress. Now they have funded Gateway. They've continued funding Gateway at the same levels as in the past. And so my guess is they see that as a strategic presence around the moon. But that could all change with a change in what we see the folks in China doing.
Okay. And I think Shep had his hand up.
Yeah, certainly China's a defense adversary at the moment. But one of the things I'd like to comment on, particularly for the NASA people in the room, we've had over 30 years of experience, intimate relations, if you will, with the Russian and other partner space programs. And I think there was a tremendous amount of information to be learned on both sides of the equation, U.S. and partners, on how we do different things and why we do them that way. I know the early crews on ISS went well out of their way to understand the logic of many of the engineers and technicians who were working on the Russian hardware as to why they did what they did. I know of no office or person in NASA today that's made any attempt to codify what we have learned and why they do things differently, and is it good, bad, or better than what we're doing. I think this is a fatal flaw for how NASA operates, and we've got to change this.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I grew up during the Cold War and had a bias and wondered why we were working with the Russians when we started in the mid-'90s. But after having been a part of that and experienced it firsthand, I absolutely agree with Shep. It was such a great experience working with the Russians and learning about how they do things and their program and their history and culture. And I agree. I think that's something that we need to not lose here in our corporate knowledge at NASA. Bonnie, you had a comment?
Well, I can follow up a little bit with that because that is part of a policy decision at NASA headquarters. There was a period of time, I think, when they had eliminated the budget for the NASA historian and knowledge capture. When you eliminate that kind of infrastructure, then it's hard for your engineers to have a place to put that knowledge. I think any government, it's like the Smithsonian or any government institution, we must keep a formal method of capturing that knowledge. We do some of it here informally, but having libraries and having, whether they're hard copy or digital, is absolutely essential. I can't even find information on flights I flew when I go to the NASA website. Fortunately, I have a garage, and I have relocated. Like, yes, some of you, I've relocated mine to Seattle, where I have a place because when Hurricane Ike came through, I lost my Russian collection, actually. But people will ask me questions, and I will go to Seattle and I will find it because I kept the hard copies, especially before we started going digital.
Yeah, that's a point well taken. I guess budget cuts are everywhere, and I went to renew my driver's license the other day and brought what the website said I needed to bring, and that apparently was wrong, and they hadn't bothered correcting the website. So, and looked like you might want to comment, Isabel.
I'm thinking about the context of Apollo and the comments that Mr. Carningham is making about the driving forces at the time and the situation today and how space station took time to build and compare the approaches. And definitely competition is an incredible motor.
Oh, absolutely, right.
And very constructive as well. If we look at the bold objectives of space exploration and how far they bring humanity and all the benefits they generate, I mean, just the technologies, the capabilities we develop, the knowledge we acquire, not only the technologies themselves, but about project management, how we work together to achieve something that important. The things we learned 50 years after we saw it this year, we were going back to Apollo and the impact still today. I mean, it was raising so much interest to think about those times and the impact it had, and it's really immense what was accomplished and the benefits for humanity. But the circumstances were very particular. So there was this big competition to beat the Russians and between Americans and Russians and the regimes, and then demonstrating supremacy and all that. It was a big motor, but it was a political commitment as well, and short enough. Like, it was a short enough timeline to achieve the goal. It was more like closer to electoral cycles. And so there was a kind of political stability, like making the bold goal, giving the resources right from the start with the objective to achieve it within like a relatively short time. All those conditions really were essential to make this big leap. But today, a nation could well decide that, okay, so because we achieved this for the moon, and then after the space station was a collaboration. So all the countries had an opportunity to improve their capabilities and to do this together. But then who's going to be the next nation to make the next big leap, in a way? Is that going to happen? And then after, bring everybody together and then share the benefits. And that's what Apollo did also, and that's what the space station after did. Because Apollo was the big leap. And then after, the nations around the world were brought in the game and all got some benefits also from that big leap and from the collaboration and the cooperation, including Canada.
Yes, absolutely.
So if we think about those different circumstances, they're very complementary. So the big leap versus the sustainable presence in space. So for the moon, there seems to be some competition arising, I would say, between maybe because of some nations emerging as spacefaring nations. But is that competition, is that context going to come back? Is there going to be a big push soon to reinvest importantly and make that big leap again, and then have this sustainable presence around the moon, and then go to Mars?
That's a really great way to think about it. I hadn't thought about it that way, of having the leap and then the sustainability that comes afterwards. I think we have a comment up here.
I've got a question for SOX, but first to comment. I was on Moon Mars under first President Bush, and we were very concerned about education and did a survey of every voting age American, asked questions to get where they were, what did they understand, so we could engage them where they are. One of the questions we asked was, does the Earth go around the sun, does the sun go around the Earth, or I don't know. Guess what? A third each. So 2/3 of the voting adults in this country did not know that the Earth goes around the sun at that time. Now we can laugh about that, we can be very upset about it, but that's where people were then. I think they still are. So we have to engage people where they are about education. Question for SOX. Urgency is important for engagement, it's important for political things, but it's really the enemy of sustainability. And sustainability, I think, comes from having a critical mass of international and commercial partners. How you're finding that balance is really important, and that's important to talk about, important to sell, I think, and you're doing a great job of that, especially now, but we need to do more of that. I come at it from I had an experience on Apollo a little different than Waltz. I was the co-op at JSC at that time, was the last person hired JSC before Apollo was canceled. So guess what? I was the first person fired. That really was an impactful event on me because it helped me understand you've got to build sustainability in, and real sustainability, not just talk about it, but build it in, and that takes real effort. Building that in is critically important. So I'm curious how you're finding that balance of, and race, beware of race. We did a race thing and almost killed us. So beware of races for urgency here. But how do you find the balance between urgency and real sustainability is my question.
Well, you're right. I mean, you have to figure out how you keep going. I mean, I remember back when I first joined NASA, the Space Exploration Initiative was underway. We were all talking about how the space station was going to feed forward and all the things we were going to do on station that would take us to the moon and Mars. And I remember we had these buttons that said Mars or bust on them. And the idea is we'd get to wear those around, right? And that would remind us that what we were doing on space station was connected to something bigger, something further out. And then this order came down from headquarters, and I'm sure it was very well-meaning, that we had to get rid of those, get rid of all the Mars or bust buttons. I still have mine. It's on the wall in my office at NASA headquarters. We stopped talking about that, and it was because everybody wanted us to focus on getting space station done, urgency, right, instead of sustainability. And so we bounced back and forth lots of times. And so we do think about that every day. So what we're trying to do is take this sense of urgency and use it to our advantage to make some changes that need to be made inside my organization, inside the agency, but at the same time maintain a program that can keep going whether the funding gets turned up and we go faster, or if the funding gets turned down and we have to go slower, or if we have a hiccup along the way, if we have a loss of a payload, a loss of a vehicle, that we can continue. So maintaining that sustainability. And we're thinking about it everywhere. If you look at the procurement for the landers that's out, you'll see there's two options in that. One is for the fast option that gets us to the surface, and the other is for the sustainable option that allows us to use landers over and over and over.
So I look at sustainability as a real partnerships. That's the critical mass. Critical mass of partnerships is real sustainability.
We're almost out of time, but I do want to introduce one more topic, just for to end on a positive note. And Isabel mentioned the competition and commercial, and you guys, I'm sure just about everyone in this room knows the story. United Launch Alliance had the monopoly on United States government launches for long time, and along comes SpaceX, and everybody in the industry was skeptical about SpaceX and said, you can't do these things. We looked at all this stuff and it's not going to work. Well, guess what? SpaceX did it. They cut the launch cost quite a bit for a satellite. And now, today, and for the last couple of years, United Launch Alliance, which said it was impossible, is now making a so-called low-cost rocket called the Vulcan, or working on it, to compete with SpaceX. So competition is a wonderful thing. It's a very American thing, and it's good for all of us. So the competition aside, we were talking about politics, and when you have a company like SpaceX that's run by Elon Musk, and you have a company like Blue Origin that's run by Jeff Bezos, the politics are lined up because those guys set the politics, right? And they're going to go do it. And so SpaceX, of course, has announced that they're building their Starship. They've got a prototype built down in Boca Chica, down south, and they said they're going to launch the first of all, this Japanese investor and 15 of his closest friends around the moon in the next few years. But Elon Musk, and Sox can talk about this, is very serious about putting a colony on Mars. Okay, and then Jeff Bezos, of course, wants to build infrastructure in cislunar space. And so one of the topics we're supposed to talk about is, commercial government collaboration and how that might work. So I'm going to pick on Sox again. Do you see that as a possibility, of leveraging the ability of a commercial company to move quickly with the experience, the decades of experience and know-how that NASA has to try to leverage both of those things to get back to the moon and onto Mars sooner rather than later?
Well, first, it is possible, but it's hard. Somebody told me the other day about a class they went to where they looked at how you start innovative organizations inside large organizations that may have gotten stale, and from the lesson he was taught there, basically what happens is those little innovative parts get eaten up. The bigger company will overwhelm them. And if you look back, at NASA, we set up a very innovative group to handle the COTS program, the Commercial Orbital Transportation System program. And the way that worked was 2 commercial providers came on board, and NASA, in the Skunk Works model, was going to have very little interaction with them. We were only going to send experts out to work with them and only try to provide them help and try to hinder as little as possible. And for what really was a pretty small amount of money, we ended up with 2 launch vehicles and 2 cargo transportation systems that are still flying today, right? And the motivation for the contractors in that effort was that they would get additional funding when they flew those vehicles commercially, and they would own and operate the vehicles. And it all worked. But a lot of what we learned there wasn't taken as a good lesson by the larger NASA. It was like, oh my gosh, yeah, you don't need a whole big organization if you operate in this model. And there is a desire in any organization to preserve yourself, to preserve your organization. And so when we got to Commercial Crew, we ended up with something that's kind of in between what we had for the Orion program or the shuttle program and what we had for COTS. And if you look, the costs went up. It takes longer to get things done. But most people felt that it was appropriate when you were flying crews on a vehicle to take that type of effort. And we have a chance of sort of getting the best of both worlds. But when we started talking landers, one of the initial thoughts from outside was that we should go to a COTS model. And there were a lot of people pushing it, and we could not get there. That was not something we could do. It would have taken us years to get the procurement in place just because of the battle over what that might do to NASA. So what we decided to do instead was to follow the Commercial Crew model, something in the middle, and see how much good we could get from that effort, from that commercial effort. And I think there's a good chance that it's going to work. What I'm seeing is enough people do remember the good lessons from COTS and the lessons learned from Commercial Crew that we can funnel those in. And part of what we're doing is we're going to do this collaborative effort with the commercial providers. The idea is to get 50 engineers, some of our best engineers, but also some of our freshest hires, working with those commercial companies so that our people can transfer information to them and they can transfer information to us. So hopefully to sort of cross-pollinate between both worlds.
Can I say you've been waiting patiently here? Please.
Wanted to follow up with Isabel's comment, which I think was very insightful, how to catapult research in a more proactive as opposed to a reactive way. I recall DARPA was established in 1958 when Sputnik hit. And although I think many people here weren't alive at that time, looking at the DARPA model seems like a very successful approach potentially for NASA to look at, because innovation comes from insight and visioning of the future. So thoughts about how to implement more of this innovative type R&D model that clearly builds on industry partnerships and high risk, high payoff.
Anybody like to comment on that, Bonnie?
Yes. So I talked a little bit about the university involvement, and from what I understand and talking to some of the engineers that I started working with back when I started out as a flight controller in 1978, and I was OJT with the flight controllers and engineers that took us to the moon. So there was a lot of verbal information passed down, but part of the NASA DARPA model, in a way, was the way they were funding the universities. It didn't all come from NASA headquarters. It came down to the centers. It came down to the division directors in engineering. And as we got ready for Apollo, it wasn't one solution that was funded. They might look at 3 different options. They would take it to a certain TRL level, and then they would down select so that they increased their opportunities for success. But technology was not just born out of the winner of that TRL down select. It was also born out of the other things that came out of it, the serendipity of research. And then we hired those students and faculty to help us develop it into a mature product. If you start hiring students after they're out of the university and they haven't had any experience at all in space flight, there is a steep learning curve. You know, you need to let us, Mike and I, ensure that you're going to hire students that are going to hit the ground running.
All right. Well, well, George, I'm only 7 minutes over this year. So thank you to our panel. Thank you for your wonderful questions. Sorry we didn't have a little more time. Thank you to the panel.
I'd like to thank the panel. That was a very good discussion. But as Walt said, the times are different. And there are two things that I think strike me as being very different. Back when we started the Apollo program, we did bring all the universities into it. There was a conscious effort to bring the universities into it and make it a part of the program. The other thing that was very apparent in when we started Apollo, there's a great deal of debate about the architecture we should use, rather than just having a given architecture that maybe was not the best architecture. And there doesn't seem to be that much debate going on about the architecture that NASA's pursuing. And that can have a profound effect on the program being successful. So those are two things that we need to look at. But thank you all, and we have our speaker here. So if you will move into a seat here in the audience, then we'll let our speaker talk.